September 1944. Evening gathered slowly over the flat fields of Michigan, and the first chill of autumn had begun to settle into the furrows between rows of beets. The light was going thin, turning barnwood black and kitchen windows gold. Somewhere beyond the fields, a truck coughed to a halt. Boots scraped dirt. Tin cups clicked against one another. In the house, fat hissed in a skillet. Breadcrumbs darkened, onions softened in a low, sweet heat, and the smell drifted out through a screen door into the cooling air. It was the kind of smell that could stop a hungry man in mid-step. Not because it was rare in America, but because it was ordinary. And for the German prisoners walking in from the fields under guard, ordinary American food could feel like a hallucination. They had not imagined America like this. They had imagined distance factories, perhaps, and skyscrapers if they believed the postcards, or else they imagined because they had been taught to imagine it. A swollen and artificial land, decadent, rootless, weak in spirit, loud in appetite, incapable of sacrifice. Some had heard stranger things. Nazi propaganda had told soldiers that the Luftwaffe had struck American cities hard, that the New World was not so invulnerable after all, that beneath the industrial surface stood a soft people. But when some of those prisoners first crossed the United States by train, one later remembered that they pressed their noses to the glass and saw not ruin, but the abundance of automobiles everywhere. It was one of those small shocks that begins in the eyes and ends, much later, in belief. That is why a supper table could become a battlefield of its own. Not a battlefield of shells and steel, but of expectation and evidence. A regime can survive military defeat longer than it can survive comparison. Men trained to see the enemy as cruel and collapsing found themselves in a country whose roads seemed full, whose farms seemed alive, whose storehouses seemed endless, whose kitchens seemed to produce warmth as if from instinct. The contradiction did not arrive as an argument. It arrived as steam from a plate. The dish set before them that evening had an almost comic name: city chicken. It was not chicken at all. It was pork and veal worked around a wooden stick into the shape of a drumstick, then breaded, fried, and baked until golden. It belonged to the practical imagination of industrial America, especially in Midwestern and Rust Belt communities, where immigrant families had learned, through hard years, how to make dignity out of substitution. During the Depression, city chicken had stood in for a bird that many families could not afford. One reference from the era described it plainly: ground veal and pork shaped around sticks to resemble drumsticks, rolled in crumbs, fried and baked until brown. A false chicken, perhaps, but a real meal. And that irony mattered, because this was not merely a story about plenty. It was about a society that had passed through scarcity without building an ideology around scarcity. America had known soup lines, bread lines, hunger, substitution, stretching, salvaging, making do. It had known mothers turning leftovers into a second and third life. It had known the grim arithmetic of the Depression, when people scavenged for scraps while fields still yielded crops no one could profitably sell. City chicken was born in that world, not in luxury, but in adaptation. It was a poor household's illusion and a working family's answer. Yet in wartime America, even that old imitation could appear on a plate beside potatoes, gravy, bread, milk, and butter. That was the point. A nation that could make theater out of shortage in the 1930s could, by 1944, make abundance seem routine. For the German prisoners, the wooden skewer at the center of that meal held more than meat. It held confusion. The shape suggested one thing, the taste another. It seemed at once playful and excessive. Why would a country wealthy enough to serve real chicken make fake chicken? Why would a people burdened by rationing still cook a dish with this much care, this much crust, this much ceremony? But that question missed the deeper truth. The meal was not an expression of fraud. It was an expression of continuity. Americans did not stop being inventive when they became powerful. They carried older habits of improvisation into their era of industrial supremacy. The dish was modest. The civilization behind it was not. By the time such prisoners sat down to American meals, the economic difference between the two war systems had already become overwhelming. The United States did not simply outproduce Germany. It expanded on a scale that made enemy calculations feel provincial. A War Production Board report later stated that the increase in American output alone was considerably greater than the total munitions output of our enemies. In the same years, U.S. gross national product rose from $88.6 billion to $198.7 billion before price adjustment, while total munitions production reached $186 billion. American manufacturing nearly tripled in 5 years. It built more planes, more tanks, more ships, more rifles, more shells, and more trucks than enemies and allies alike could easily comprehend. Statistics like that are usually told in the language of steel, but they also belong to flour, butter, canned fruit, slaughterhouses, rail lines, refrigerators, and kitchen stoves. The war was fought not only by men at the front, but by systems behind them. The German war system was ferocious, disciplined, and often tactically brilliant. But it was never as rich as the myths wrapped around it. It relied on conquest to cover weaknesses, coercion to fill labor gaps, and propaganda to disguise limits that logistics could not solve. The American system, by contrast, did something that authoritarian states often underestimate. It converted open society into organized mass production without extinguishing the habits of civilian life. That was what a German prisoner could sense even before he understood it. The fields were cultivated. The roads moved. The mail came. The stores held stock. The barns filled and emptied. The guard towers were there, but so were schoolhouses, filling stations, silos, county fairs, soft bread, enamel signs, and church bells. The enemy did not look starved by war. It looked enlarged by it. Officially, the prisoners in the United States were to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. In practice, that meant something astonishing to many of them. The United States housed more than 425,000 prisoners of war during the conflict, most of them Germans, in more than 700 camps. They were fed, clothed, given toiletries, and provided medical and dental care on the same standard as U.S. troops. Many worked outside camp on labor details, especially in agriculture, canning, and packing, where wartime labor shortages were severe. To a propagandized imagination, captivity in America was supposed to mean humiliation, revenge, perhaps even death. Instead, it often meant order, calories, and bewildering regularity. That does not mean captivity was pleasant, or that prisoners ceased being prisoners. Wire was still wire. Watchtowers were still watchtowers. Shame traveled with surrender. News from home still arrived thin and broken. Some men remained loyal to the Reich in spirit long after its moral collapse had become obvious to others. Nazi hierarchies reproduced themselves inside camps. Hardliners bullied doubters. Fear moved through barracks by rumor and pressure. Yet even there, appetite was doing its patient work. Ideology can command posture. It can command silence. It can command slogans. It cannot easily command the body to forget what the body has learned. The body learned first through rations. American military food had its own reputation among Allied troops, not all of it flattering. Rations were compact, functional, and intended for mobility, not culinary romance. The U.S. Army later summarized that the K-ration, officially adopted in 1942, yielded about 8,300 calories across its full issue, while the C-ration, adopted earlier, provided roughly 2,974 calories with meat and vegetable cans, crackers, sugar, and soluble coffee. Soldiers complained, as soldiers always do. They mocked, traded, hoarded, and cursed their rations. But to men who had known harsher scarcity, even American field food could appear lavish. That contrast sharpened further in camps and on farm details, where meals were often fuller than frontline rations. One prisoner, identified in a later scholarly account as Helmut W. Tum, wrote with something like disbelief, "Here we eat more in a single day than during a whole week at home." He described fruit appearing almost daily and portions of meat so large they seemed unreal. Another record noted that many German POWs gained considerable weight in American custody. There were civilians in the United States who resented this, who saw prisoners receiving ample food, while Americans themselves lived with ration books and wartime limits. But resentment itself became a kind of testimony. If the public complained that German prisoners were eating too well, then the prisoners had already seen enough to know the propaganda had lied. And so we return to that table in Michigan, to the breaded meat on the wooden stick, to the plate set down before men who had expected the worst and found instead a puzzle. No archive preserves the exact look on the first face that recognized the joke of city chicken. No camp report records the silence after the first bite. But the larger scene is entirely believable because the documents around it are so consistent. Prisoners spoke of quantity, Civilians remembered their amazement. A teenager working in a local ice cream shop later recalled that the German prisoners were stunned by how well they were treated and fed. Former prisoner Carl Jung wrote to an American farmer years later, remembering how hunger had pained them, how they had fell over the piles of beefsteaks, and how bowl after bowl of food had been brought to them. There is one image from that body of testimony that lingers with unusual force. A 1944 newspaper account, preserved in later scholarship, described creamery butter in pound cartons stacked high, with German prisoners unwrapping and cutting it into generous squares. Butter is easy to overlook in grand history. It does not thunder. It does not march. It does not alter maps. But butter on bread tells the truth about a society, faster than many speeches do. It tells you about cows, refrigeration, rail transport, packaging, labor, feed grain, factory paper, distribution, and confidence. It tells you that somewhere far from the front, systems are functioning. And to men from a continent where the war had begun to consume everything, soft, yellow butter in thick slabs could feel almost obscene in its calmness. That is why the city chicken matters, not because it was the greatest meal they ate, and not because every German prisoner in America tasted it. It matters because of what it condensed into one humble object. Here was a nation so secure in its domestic habits that it could serve an old depression substitute as comfort food in wartime and still seem abundant. Here was a democracy whose kitchens contained memory of immigrant thrift, of urban hardship, of meat counters, church suppers, wage packets, and mothers who knew how to stretch dinner without surrendering pride. The wooden skewer carried all of that. It was not elegant. It was not imperial. It was democratic in the deepest sense, ordinary, adaptable, and meant to be shared at a table, not displayed behind glass. The German soldiers had expected a hierarchy of force. What many of them encountered instead was a hierarchy of supply. They had been taught that nations were ultimately organized by will, race, obedience, and sacrifice. America suggested another principle, that power could also arise from loose networks of farms, roads, unions, warehouses, diners, county extension offices, supermarkets, rail spurs, truck depots, cold storage, local butchers' women's clubs, ration boards, and factories turning out both artillery shells and breakfast cereal boxes. That structure did not feel heroic in the European sense. It felt civilian, which was precisely the revelation. Even American rationing, when seen from the outside, could become part of the illusion. Americans complained, and with reason, about ration points, shortages, substitutes, and restrictions. Yet wartime rationing in the United States was not a symptom of collapse. It was a management system for plenty under pressure. A Labor Department bulletin from 1945 noted that chicken was unusually plentiful in the early fall of 1944, and that poultry had never been rationed the way some other foods were. Families adjusted their buying patterns under red point systems for meat and fats. But the point is not that wartime America had infinite food. The point is that even controlled American scarcity often looked like wealth to men arriving from exhausted theaters of war. This difference between internal complaint and external appearance is one of the great engines of historical irony. Americans grumbled over ration books, while German prisoners stared at white bread, fruit, butter, milk, coffee, cigarettes, and meat portions that seemed outside reason. Americans saw inconvenience. The prisoners saw inconvenience. The prisoners saw evidence. And evidence accumulates. It accumulates in train windows full of automobiles and camp canteens, with candy and tobacco in work details that end with second helpings, and the simple fact that people who can criticize their own government still seem loyal to their nation. That last detail mattered as much as any meal. The prisoners did not just witness abundance. They witnessed dissent without collapse, complaint without treason, ordinary life without uniformity. That combination was harder on Nazi assumptions than hunger ever could have been. In time, some of them began to understand that food was not merely food in America. It was a language. Coffee meant shipping and habit. Soft bread meant mills, yeast, ovens, packaging, and expectation. Fruit out of season meant distance conquered by transport. Butter meant refrigeration. Ice cream meant leisure, not yet extinguished by war. And a dish like city chicken meant something more intimate, that families had the power to preserve culture at the dinner table, even while the state mobilized for global conflict. Authoritarian systems often promise total unity. Democracies frequently offer something less theatrical but more durable, Continuity in the private sphere. The skewer on the plate, crust brown just enough, was private continuity made visible. Some of the prisoners resisted what they were seeing. Resistance took many forms. It could be pride, denial, stubbornness, or shame. To admit the enemy was treating you decently was already a small betrayal of the worldview that had sustained you through battle. To admit the enemy was wealthier, more organized, and perhaps more humane than you had been told was worse. To admit that this enemy was also a democracy was worst of all, for that meant the Nazi state had not merely lied about America's character, it had lied about political reality itself. The decadent republic was not collapsing, it was feeding its captives. And yet transformation rarely happens with trumpet blasts. It happens by erosion, by repeated contradiction, by the daily embarrassment of facts. A scholar of German POW experience in Michigan summarized it starkly. Nazi ideology collapsed when prisoners witnessed the humane treatment of Allied soldiers and civilians. That collapse was not uniform and was not universal, but was real enough to trace. Friendships formed. Farmers hired prisoners for labor details, and sometimes came to know them as men rather than abstractions. Prisoners observed that Americans could criticize Roosevelt, joke about the war, argue politics, worship differently, and still belong to the same national effort. Democracy, in other words, appeared less as a textbook and more as a social climate. Here, the emotional contrast deepens. German soldiers had expected captivity to strip them of dignity. Instead, what stripped them was comparison. The humiliation was not only defeat on the battlefield, it was a realization that the enemy's confidence did not always need to shout. A guard did not need to boast that America was rich. A farmer's wife placing a platter on a table did that more effectively. A canteen shelf did it. A carton of butter did it. A second serving did it. The smell from the kitchen did it. Ideology had promised a warrior civilization of discipline and destiny. The supper table offered another civilization altogether, untidy, commercial, local, religious, practical, immigrant, argumentative, and most dangerous of all well-fed. The city chicken, then, becomes almost too perfect a symbol, not because it was authentic poultry, but because it was authentic America. It embodied substitution without humiliation. It was a working-class sleight of hand turned into tradition. In Germany, wartime substitution had increasingly become a sign that the circle was tightening. Ersatz coffee, missing fats, shrinking expectations, rumors of shortages, and the constant knowledge that fronts consumed what homes needed, these were signs of a state reaching into every corner of life. In America, substitution could still arrive wearing breadcrumbs and comfort. It could still taste like hospitality. The difference is not trivial. It is the difference between a society bending and a society hollowing out. The men at that Michigan table could not have known every statistic behind what they were seeing. They did not know the full scale of American munitions production or the dollar value of the national product. They likely did not know how many cargo ships were sliding down American ways, how many aircraft were leaving assembly lines, how many cans were being filled, sealed, labeled, boxed, shipped, and opened across the world. But they did not need the full ledger. History often enters consciousness through fragments: a tray, a smell, a bite, a slab of butter, an orchard, a road thick with cars, a work detail that ends with pie. Men do not need economists to tell them when a system has depth. They can taste it. And once tasted, it becomes difficult to untaste. That is where the event changes from anecdote to historical meaning. Food challenged fear first, then pride, then doctrine. A prisoner who eats well in enemy hands must revise one belief. A prisoner who eats well repeatedly must revise many. If he also sees that civilians are not starving, that factories are not ruins, that local people are not the racial cartoon promised by propaganda, and that disagreement exists without state disintegration, then ideology begins to thin. Not vanish at once. Thin. Fray. Admit light. This is why post-war reeducation did not begin only in formal camp programs, newspapers, classes, or screened films. It began before the lesson plan, before the pamphlet, before the lecture. It began in the ordinary, in line for chow, in work among farmers, in the recognition that the people who were supposed to be decadent enemies had habits of fairness, abundance, and self-organization that could not easily be dismissed. Some prisoners later supported the idea of a democratic Germany not because a lecture persuaded them in one afternoon, but because lived experience had already broken the seal around older assumptions. Of course, it would be sentimental to claim that a single meal transformed hardened believers into Democrats. History is more stubborn than that. Some POWs remained convinced Nazis. Some adapted outwardly and reverted inwardly. Some were grateful for the food, but not for the lesson. Others compartmentalized America was rich, yes, but still spiritually inferior in their minds. Human beings are fully capable of chewing contradiction for years. But the meal still mattered, because it inserted contradiction where certainty had once lived. The city chicken did not convert everyone. It did something more realistic. It unsettled. There's a scene one can imagine, and imagine responsibly, because the records surrounding it are strong. A prisoner lifts the breaded piece by its wooden stick and turns it in the light. For a second, it resembles a drumstick from some country kitchen. Then the bite gives it away. Pork. Veal. Not chicken. A counterfeit, and yet better than many truths he has known recently. The room smells of fried crust and gravy. Maybe there is white bread nearby. Maybe boiled potatoes glossed with butter. Maybe canned peaches or apples at the end. He looks at the skewer again. America, he begins to sense, is a place where even imitation arrives with confidence. Confidence is an underrated historical force. Armies run on it. Economies amplify it. Democracies, when they possess it, make it look effortless. The United States, in 1944, was not effortless. It was mobilized, tense, grieving, and full of strain, like pain before the farmer's table. Another remembered abundance on American roads. These are not the usual images of ideological collapse, but perhaps they should be. Belief systems do not only shatter under artillery, they also dissolve under evidence that life can be lived differently, more generously, less fearfully, and with fewer lies required to hold it together. There is an old temptation in war stories to make everything hinge on heroics alone. Charges, speeches, last stands, dramatic maps, burning horizons. But wars are also judged in kitchens. They are judged in rail depots, granaries, ration books, butcher paper, and the smell coming through a screen door at dusk. Theasic, Pavin, 2 orders. The United States, for all its flaws and hypocrisies, demonstrated a different form of power. The power to preserve daily life while expanding war production to continental scale. The War Production Board could express that in numbers. Prisoners could express it in appetite. Both were telling the same story. So the evening closes. Outside, the light is almost gone from the fields. The guards are silhouettes now. Somewhere a screen door snaps shut. Dishes are scraped. Water runs into a basin. The prisoners return to barracks or trucks or the slow rituals of captivity. Nothing outwardly historic has happened. No treaty signed, no city taken, no gun fired, and yet something has shifted. A man who arrived carrying a complete explanation of the world now carries a splinter in that explanation. It is no bigger than a wooden skewer, but splinters work inward. Perhaps that is the final lesson of City Chicken. Freedom does not always announce itself in marble language. Sometimes it appears as a society with enough room to remember an old poor recipe and enough wealth to serve it generously to the men who came as enemies. Sometimes abundance is not the eagle on the standard or the bomber overhead, but the quiet certainty that supper will come, that it will be shared, that it may even include butter thick enough to scandalize a hungry soldier. Sometimes democracy proves itself not only by elections or constitutions, but by the ordinary mercy of systems that keep people fed without demanding they worship the state in return. And that is why the memory endures. Not because the meal was called chicken when it was not, but because the lie was in the name and the truth was on the plate. The false drumstick revealed the real country. A country improvised by immigrants and laborers. Families still feared telegrams. Trains still carried sons away. Casualty lists lengthened. Factories worked shifts that bent human endurance. Fields lacked labor. Black Americans fought for victory abroad and civil rights at home. Japanese American families suffered unjust incarceration. Nothing about the nation was simple or pure, but the country's productive and civic confidence remained visible enough that even its contradictions did not conceal its scale. That, too, was part of what prisoners encountered. Not a flawless democracy, but a functioning one, and functioning democracies are uniquely hard for totalitarian myths to explain. Tyrannies understand fear. They understand spectacle. They understand command. They struggle to explain why free people continue to cooperate when no one is standing over each of them with a rifle. They struggle to explain why a noisy, divided republic can still fill freight cars, stock canteens, feed prisoners, and expand industrial output until enemy strategists begin to feel as if they are counting against the tide. The city chicken on its stick was a tiny answer to that riddle. Not a grand answer, a domestic one, and perhaps therefore stronger. Somewhere in the background of that answer was the older America that had made the dish in the first place. Immigrant butcher shops, Catholic kitchens, boarding houses, mill towns, wage envelopes, tenements, and neighborhoods where names from Eastern and Southern Europe still clung to doorbells and parish rolls. For German prisoners, especially those moving through the Midwest, that social familiarity may have deepened the shock. They were not seeing an alien civilization in some science fiction register. They were seeing a recognizable world reorganized under different political assumptions and far greater material capacity. The houses were larger, perhaps, the roads broader, the stores fuller, but the rhythms could feel strangely legible. This was modernity without a furor. And then there is the deeper symbolism of the stick itself. A wooden skewer is a cheap thing, disposable, almost laughably humble. Yet there it is, carrying the weight of a whole story. A nation coming out of depression had once used that stick to hold together a substitute for poultry. A nation in World War now used the same old recipe as memory and comfort. The stick held shape where otherwise the meat would have fallen apart. In that sense, it becomes a fitting emblem for democracy. Not glamorous, not eternal, not self-sustaining, but a support structure that allows ordinary life to keep its form under pressure. Freedom, too, often looks less like a monument than like an unnoticed support. Years later, survivors and witnesses remembered not only the food, but the feeling around it. They remembered amazement. They remembered quantity. They remembered the strange humanity of it. One remembered hunger, organized by roads and factories, argued over by free citizens, scarred by its own injustices, yet vast enough to feed its armies, its workers, and even its captives. A country whose power could be measured in tanks and bombers, yes, but also in fried crumbs, white bread, fruit, butter, and the smell of supper crossing a field at dusk. In the end, the German prisoners did not merely discover that city chicken was not chicken. They discovered something more unsettling. They discovered that the democracy they had been taught to despise could transform scarcity into comfort, production into security, and even captivity into a lesson their ideology had no answer for. On a small wooden stick, in one Midwestern meal, they tasted the difference between a regime that devoured life and a society that, however imperfectly, still knew how to nourish it.